All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming out on a Sunday morning after the party. I'm very delighted to present on behalf this wonderful working group of the Sentinel Innovation Center on a project on principal approaches to handle partially observed confounded data in electronic health records, and these are my disclosures. So claims data have been the backbone for most of pharmacoepi studies in the last decades, but there's an increasing interest in linking these data to electronic health records for us to capture variables which are usually not measurable in claims, such as granular clinical variables like labs, vitals, disease-specific data, and so on. However, as we all know, these variables are often just partially observed and or are not measured uniformly for every patient at the very exact time point that we would like to have them measured, which creates challenges in the statistical analysis due to missing data. And so missing data and confounding factors can be very frequent, and according to Rubin, there are two taxonomies to classify missing data, which can be missing data mechanisms and missing data patterns. The unresolved challenges for causal inference is that those missing data assumptions are very hard to test. In an empirical study, we usually don't know which of the missing data mechanisms and patterns underlying or most likely hold, which would essentially drive our decision which analytic approach we would choose in a statistical analysis to approach this missing data. And so as part of the Sentinel Innovation Center project, we aim to develop a principal approach and framework and tools to assess the mechanism and patterns empirically of the missing data processes and connect this with the most appropriate analytical method based on the underlying assumptions that we would reveal based on those diagnostics. And to that end, we performed a plasmode simulation study using a US EHR claims database linkage, where we derived an empirical cohort of diabetic patients who initiated SGLT2 inhibitors versus DPP4 inhibitors. And we restricted this empirical cohort to 3 subcohorts with complete information on 3 confounders of interest, which we defined as HbA1c lab value, BMI, and smoking. To all of the 3 confounder of interest complete cohorts, we applied the parametric bootstrap. So we performed a plasmode simulation by generating an outcome, including the exposure, the confounder of interest, and 25 selected prognostic covariates, which I want to refer to as C1 covariates. We defined the true exposure treatment effect as a null association. The outcome in this case was a composite cardiovascular outcome. And for each of the complete cohorts, we simulated and resampled 100 cohorts of each 1,000 patients. And we did all steps all over again by simulating additional 100 cohorts each by including a interaction term between the confounder of interest and the exposure to simulate heterogeneous treatment effects. Now, for all created plasmode simulated cohorts, we additionally created 4 different missingness according to 4 different missingness mechanisms with varying proportions between 10 and 50%. And we computed empirical diagnostics to see how well they would characterize the underlying missingness mechanism of the partially observed confounder of interest, and finally also examined how well different analytic approaches, namely complete case analysis, inverse probability weighting, missingness indicator method, and single and imputation approaches would be able to recover the true log hazard ratio. Now, the 4 different simulated missingness mechanisms followed essentially the mechanisms shown in this DAX. So there was missing completely at random, where the missingness, here denoted with the node M, was not associated with any observed or unobserved covariate in the data set, whereas under a missing at random mechanism, the missingness likelihood was computed as a weighted sum score derived from the values of the fully observed C1 covariates. And we additionally considered 2 missing not at random mechanism, where under a MNAR unmeasured mechanism, the missingness was dependent on an unmeasured confounder. And in the missingness not at random value mechanism, the missingness was dependent on the value of the confounder of interest itself. Now, the empirical diagnostics to characterize the missingness were essentially classified as 3 group diagnostics. In the first group diagnostic, we assessed and compared the distributions of patient characteristics at baseline stratified by patients who were observed with a value for the confound of interest versus those with a missing value. And analogous to propensity scores, we computed standardized mean differences, where we assumed that a standardized mean difference below 10% would mean no imbalance, for which we then would assume a missing completely at random or a missing not at random mechanism. Whereas in standardized mean difference values above 10%, we would assume missing at random because we would see imbalances in those patient characteristics. And also following this logic, Hottling and Little actually suggested or proposed different multivariate tests, formal hypothesis tests where high test statistics and low p-values would essentially also show imbalances for which would then indicate a missing at random mechanism. In the group 2 diagnostic, we then assessed the ability to predict confounder missingness based on a fitted random forest classification model, for which we assumed that AUC values around 0.5 would indicate a rather random prediction, for which we then would conclude that the missingness would follow a missing completely at random or not at random mechanism because we cannot predict the missingness. And values meaningfully above 0.5 would rather indicate that there are more relationships between the covariates and the missingness, for which we then would assume missing at random. Then finally, the group 3 diagnostics with where we would fit Cox proportional hazard models. Here we would assume that if we see no association in a univariate model, so just with the missingness indicator for the confound of interest, nor for the adjusted model, this would likely follow a missing completely at random mechanism, whereas we assumed that if there was an association in the univariate, so more spurious association, but no association then in the fully adjusted model, we would assume missing at random. And finally, if we would see a meaningful difference in both univariate and adjusted models, we would assume missing not at random. And so these are the diagnostic results. So the plasmid simulations revealed quite characteristic patterns across the different group diagnostics and the diagnostic parameters that pretty well matched our assumptions of the underlying missingness data structure. And especially for missing completely at random and at random, we were quite confident to be able to differentiate based on all 3 group diagnostics, whereas it was more difficult to differentiate, for example, missing completely at random and missing not at random mechanisms, where the difference really was more observed in the group 3 diagnostic, because in missing completely at random, as we assumed, we did not see any association nor in the univariate nor in the adjusted model, whereas under an MNAR unmeasured and MNAR value mechanism, we would always see significant differences in the outcome. In terms of the analytic results, overall, we found that multiple imputation approaches resulted in the lowest root mean squared error bias and were the most efficient models. We also saw marginal benefits for non-parametric multiple imputation models like classification and regression trees or random forest imputation models in situations with simulated heterogeneous treatment effects. And this was actually also observed, so we observed a similar relative performance when stratified by missingness mechanism. However, in comparison, across all the different analytic approaches, we saw the highest root mean squared error for MNAR value mechanisms. So in conclusion, we felt quite confident that those underlying missingness diagnostics could be quite helpful in the design stage for a real-world evidence study to get a better idea about the underlying missingness structure and the recoverability of the values, for example, using multiple imputation. And in order to streamline that, we wrapped all of that in an R package called Structural Missing Data Investigations. You can find it on CRAN, download it for free, and you can actually streamline all of these 3 group diagnostics with this R package in just a matter of 2 lines of code. And if you go to the website, you can also see a lot of tutorials, vignettes, and more documentation on how to implement it for your real-world evidence study. With that, thank you. And if you want to access the code for the simulation, you can do that here under this link.
it work? Okay, perfect. It's a bit awkward. Thank you. For now, we have 5 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, also for the people in the back, you can still sit in the front. If you have a question, please come to the microphone. To kick things off, I also prepared some questions so you can warm up. I was wondering, you used plasma simulation, which I have never heard of before. So could you maybe explain why you chose that?
Yeah, so plasmid simulation is a simulation study where you do not essentially specify everything de novo, but you can take advantage of the complex correlations that are already underlying in the real-world data missingness, in the real-world data sets, and can make use of the different covariate correlations in a more higher dimensional space, for which we actually also tested what happens if we have like additional covariates available, such as auxiliary covariates, which, by the way, I did not have it in my slides, but which actually improved also the performance of multiple imputation models.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting technique. I'm interested in using it myself. I also saw that in this model you used, or the study you did now, you used one confounder where you varied the missingness. Do you have any plans of expanding on that into multiple confounders? Because I know often we have more than one.
Yeah, right. So we wanted to at least keep this variable constant to just have one variable, though this is a rather unrealistic assumption to just have one confounder missing. Usually we deal with multivariate missingness, and we are currently in the process of validating this method using multivariate missing data, actually at our partner site at Duke, where we validate this method. And we've also done some more simulations where we also included like missingness data patterns, so monotone and non-monotone missing data patterns. And I think something to note here is that, especially this group 2 diagnostic, which I presented, so to predict the missingness, actually if you have monotone missingness, so if the missingness of one confounder would predict the missingness of the other confounder, your group 2 diagnostic AUC value will be inflated. So in this case, it would make more sense to not even consider, for the sake of the missingness diagnostics, the other partially observed confounder data, and just do it like one by one.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Please come forward.
Thank you. Very nice presentation. Missing data is always a key interest. So I just wonder if you could comment on 2 things. Number one is healthcare data. Sometimes it's not missing, it's just the doctor may not think the test is necessary or helpful for the patient, right? So just wonder if you could comment on how do we identify, how do we even define missing data relative to it's intended data not to be collected. This is number one comment. Number two is I heard many cases healthcare data missing is more likely not at random, more than not. I just wonder, in case missing is not at random, what would you recommend?
Mm-hmm. Yes, for your first question, for the intention of not measuring a certain lab or a certain variable by the physician, that's actually a common scenario. And there can be so many different scenarios of why something is missing or not missing. I think what we really care about is if the missingness is informative for the outcome that we study, and that actually leads to your second question. If we have missing not at random, for example, patients who have a certain extreme level of a lab are less likely or more likely to get tested, and this is also prognostic for outcome. This is then what I would refer to as, or what we investigated here as an MNOW value mechanism. So here, imputation approaches did not work that well, but it also always depends on the strength of your confounder, because we just looked here at missingness in the confounder, not in the outcome or in the exposure. And so if you have a very strong confounder, it can make a lot of difference. In my experience, if the confounding strength is rather weak or negligible, the point estimate didn't move too much, even on an MNOW value mechanism.
Any last burning questions?
Hey, Lauren Peatlock, Optum Epidemiology. So I'm curious, I was under the belief that when you have data that's missing not at random, you'd expect any imputation approach to perform similarly. But I noticed that on your slide, when you've got the missing not at random root mean square error, there are differences between the different methods used, and I was curious if you could explain a little bit about that and how it may impact our interpretation of comparing those methods. Thank you.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, as an an MNAR value mechanism and an MNAR unmeasured mechanism. So these are two different like MNAR mechanisms. One thing that we observed, especially under the missingness that we termed as MNAR unmeasured, where the missingness was dependent on an unmeasured confounder. So this is I think this is up for debate if we want to actually call it missing not at random or at random. It really depends on how much data you have to that are correlated to this specific missingness or to the unmeasured confounder, because we felt quite confident that if we have good auxiliary variables that could recover this missing value, that also normal imputation approaches did quite well. Whereas if it's really just based on the level or the specific value of the partially observed confounder, it doesn't work so well. In these cases, there are other sensitivity analyses, which are called not at random fully conditional specified models, where you would essentially make up for the systematic difference that you would see in the observed and unobserved value, and then model this over a range of different systematic differences and see if your estimate or your treatment effect estimate would change under even extreme scenarios.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our first speaker. I'd like to invite our second speaker. Also, people standing in the back, there are still some seats in the front, so please come forward and have a seat. Our second speaker is Sudhir Venkatesan, and he will be giving a talk about accounting for treatment switching by pairwise censoring. Can you?
If I go back?
If you click here on the folder, and then go back on to the symbol.
Okay.
Take your time, just
45. Thank you.
And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to walk up after he's done. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. My name is Sudhir Venkatesan. I am a statistician. I work at AstraZeneca. And today I'll be talking to you about accounting for treatment switching by pairwise censoring. Is this really needed? Is it sufficient to mitigate attrition bias, or should more advanced methodology be used? These are our disclosures. Right, so when thinking of a methodological question like this, I often find that it's helpful to think of it in the context of a motivating case study. So let's say we're interested in doing a matched cohort study of COVID-19 vaccine effectiveness. We want to match vaccinated individuals to unvaccinated individuals in a 1-to-1 ratio, and we want to use Cox proportional hazard regression to analyze the data. The start of the follow-up will be an appropriately defined index date. The event of interest, let's say, is COVID-19 hospitalization. And when an unvaccinated individual subsequently receives vaccination during follow-up, we censor that patient at that point in time, and they no longer contribute follow-up time to the unvaccinated arm. The end of follow-up is the earliest of the event of censoring. So the question essentially that we're asking here is, when an unvaccinated patient is censored due to switching to receiving vaccination, should we also censor the matched vaccinated patient? In broader terms, when we're doing a matched cohort study, when one member of a matched unit is censored because of having their exposure status changed, should we also be censoring all members of that matched unit at that point in time? So before we move on to the simulation study where we explored this question, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the assumption of independent censoring. So the assumption of independent censoring in survival analyses requires that within any subgroup, subjects who are censored at a given time point t are representative of those who remain at risk at that point in t with respect to their survival experience. Another way to think of this is censoring is independent if censoring is random, conditional on each level of the covariates of interest. When you have dependent censoring, it usually is informative as well. So when you have a situation where an unvaccinated person receives vaccination at some point subsequently, let's say a person's been unvaccinated for a few months and then they receive vaccination in April. They probably received vaccination in April because of how old they were, because of health conditions that they had, or where they lived. So This type of censoring is clearly both dependent and informative. And if this is not handled correctly in the analyses, this could lead to attrition bias, which is a form of selection bias caused by differing rates of censoring between the exposure groups. Because it's only possible for the unexposed individuals to switch their treatment status, you can have this one-sided accrual of follow-up time if this is not handled properly. So to try and address this, we did a simulation model where we simulated 10,000 individuals, so 5,000 matched pairs matched one-to-one, indexed at 2 points in time. We then sampled from a piecewise exponential distribution, survival times, to model time-varying baseline hazards over 2 discrete time periods. And this again is to mimic a pandemic scenario where your baseline risk of outcome during the first 3 months is probably very different to the next 3 months because a new variant is circulating now. We then assumed that 80% of those who were unexposed at the start subsequently become exposed during the follow-up. And the exposure of interest here was a hypothetical treatment with 0 effectiveness. So we assumed here that the rate of event in the treated group is exactly the same as the rate of event in the untreated group. So the true hazard ratio would be 1. And we did this really because it's just easier to visualize the bias when the hazard ratio deviates from 1. So to address this question, we investigated 5 censoring strategies. So scenario 1 was no artificial censoring due to treatment switching. So this is not the intention to treat approach. We did that separately. I'll talk about that in a little while. But this is just a base case that we can compare the other scenarios to try and work out what the what the differences are between these scenarios. So scenario 2 was single censoring, where we only censored the unvaccinated or the unexposed individual at the point of subsequent exposure, but the matched exposed individual would continue to accrue follow-up time. Scenario 3 is single censoring with IPCW. Scenario 4 is pairwise censoring, so both members of a matched pair are censored when the untreated individual initiates active treatment. And scenario 5 is pairwise censoring with IPCW. So for the IPCW scenarios, we generated another covariate to predict the censoring mechanism, which was time from index to switch. So I mentioned IPCW a couple of times. So inverse probability of censoring weights, as I'm sure several of you here are aware, you can correct for dependent censoring and informative censoring by upweighting those who have not been censored. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but it does rely on some assumptions like no unmeasured confounding. So when we look at the results, we have in the base case a hazard ratio of 1, which makes sense because that's the truth and that's how we've modeled the simulation. But then when we look at the scenario 2, where we had single censoring, we get a hazard ratio of 2.147, and both 95% confidence intervals are above 1. So clearly there's some bias here in scenario 2 when you do single censoring. With scenarios 3, 4, and 5, we managed to recover the null association, so hazard ratios around 1 with 95% confidence intervals overlapping 1. So while it appears that there's no bias in the relative treatment effect, so in the hazard ratios for scenarios 3, 4, and 5, when you look at the cumulative incidence plots for scenario 4, we can see that the cumulative incidence rate is clearly underestimated when you have pairwise censoring. So on this slide, I've just got the cumulative incidence plots for each of the 5 scenarios, but this is for the overall population as opposed to the being stratified by treatment status, which you saw on the previous slide. But essentially, we see the same pattern. Pairwise censoring without IPCW is significantly underestimates the true cumulative incidence curve. Single censoring without IPCW is somewhere in between, and the scenarios with the IPCW manage to recover or approximate the true cumulative incidence quite closely. So in the previous set of results that I just showed you, we had assumed a treatment effectiveness of 0%. And that was, again, like I said, just to be able to visualize the bias a little bit better. But here we ran a set of simulations where we assumed 70% treatment effectiveness. Here, instead of the base case, we had an intention to treat analyses where there was artificial censoring due to treatment switching, but then we assumed, we analyzed the data as if there weren't. And clearly we can see that when you have such a large proportion of individuals switching and changing their exposure status, intention to treat doesn't really do a very good job. Single censoring, again, was a... Oops, sorry. I lost my slides. Yeah, so single censoring without IPCW, again, was associated with bias. The effectiveness estimate was 30%, so single censoring significantly underestimated the treatment effect, and all of the other scenarios 3, 4, and 5 managed to approximate the true hazard ratio quite closely. With the cumulative incidence plot, it's the same kind of pattern that we saw previously. Pairwise censoring without IPCW underestimates the cumulative incidence plots, but yeah, when you add IPCW, you manage to recover the true cumulative incidence plot. So just to summarize what we've seen so far, censoring of an unexposed subject due to switching is both informative and not independent. When you combine this with a time-varying baseline hazard, as you would see in a pandemic situation, if you did single censoring, you could potentially be subjecting your exposed individual to a failure rate that's different to what your unexposed individual was subject to prior to when they were censored. Pairwise censoring seeks to balance this between the two arms, and while pairwise censoring preserves the relative treatment effect, it can lead to a biased or underestimated cumulative incidence. And to summarize the results from each of our censoring strategies, when you have single censoring without IPCW, there's the most bias in treatment effectiveness estimates. When you have single censoring with IPCW, you get unbiased effectiveness estimates, but that does not preserve the matched nature of the data. So you could have a situation where two individuals in a matched pair can be assigned two different weights. Pairwise censoring without IPCW, unbiased effectiveness estimates, and preserves the matched nature of the data. However, the cumulative incidence is considerably underestimated. Pairwise censoring with IPCW clearly outperformed all of the other models, providing unbiased effectiveness estimates, correctly estimating the overall cumulative incidence, and it preserved the matched nature of the data. So again, it's worth remembering that IPCW relies on some strong assumptions. Here, we did the simulation in a way that we could adjust for the covariate that perfectly predicted the censoring mechanism. So this is my last slide. These are some initial results from an ongoing piece of work. We have made some simplifying assumptions. We're exploring the impact of the censoring mechanism and studying them when using propensity score matching, in the presence of time-varying confounders, and in the presence of competing events. I'll stop there. Happy to take questions, but also happy to take suggestions on what you think is important for us to look at for future steps. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. Are there any questions from the audience, please?
Good morning, Michelle Johnson, Funk, UNC. So you're in the setting here of matching, and I'm just going to confess my bias that I'm normally working in the weighting world of IPTW. What do you think the implications are for that environment analytically?
Good question. I guess it would probably, it would clearly be a different estimate, right? If you can have, model your censoring mechanism, and if you have a valid IPCW weight, I don't see why you couldn't do a weighted estimator to estimate the ATE. That should work.
Thank you.
Short question, please, in the interest of time.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually working on some of this because of a paper I reviewed, actually. And I was curious if you were thinking of looking at some other effects besides the hazard ratio, because the hazard ratio has a bunch of convenient properties, and I'd love to see kind of this extended to some risk differences or incidence rates even.
Yeah, no, good question. It's something that we're considering for the next steps. I'll have a chat with you later on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much. With that, I'd like to invite our third speaker, Nuvan Ratanakia, who will talk about orthogonalized regression for causal inference, a pharmacoepidemiologist's dream.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Nuvan Rathanayaka, and I'm excited to share with you some work I've done with Kathleen Hurwitz on a method called orthogonalized regression. And here are my disclosures. So orthogonalized regression is an estimator for causal inference when there's time-varying confounding, first proposed in a preprint last year by Stephen Bates and colleagues. So it's a brand new method. We've been playing with it a bit, and we think it shows a lot of promise. So the structure of this talk will be, first I'll introduce why causal inference when there's time-varying confounding is challenging. Then I'll review some of the existing methods. I'll walk through a brief case study of how to use orthogonalized regression. I'll wrap up with some simulation studies. So first up, why is causal inference with time-varying confounding challenging? And so let's take kind of a very simple running case study that I'll use throughout my talk. You're doing a randomized clinical trial, you have a binary treatment, active treatment versus control, and you're treating at 2 time points. And let's assume that there's no missing data, no measurement error, all those complications, let's set those aside for today. And so here's the schematic of the example I'll be using. So at time 1, we randomize folks to active treatment or control, denoting that as A1. Sometime afterwards, we measure some continuous covariate. Let's say it's a biomarker. And that biomarker, X1, can inform the re-randomization that happens at time 2. I'm denoting that as A2. And then afterwards, we measure a continuous outcome that I'm denoting Y. And the difficulty here, the challenge, comes in with U. U is an unmeasured common cause of both X1 and Y. So it's some unmeasured quantity that can drive both that intermediate biomarker value and the outcome at the end. And let's, just to be precise, let's suppose we want to estimate the average treatment effect comparing always treating folks against never treating folks. And so here's why, if you'd use a naive regression approach, that's not going to work in this setting. So you can see from those blue arrows, there's an arrow from X1 into the treatment at time 2, and there's a path from X1 to the outcome. So it's a confounder. So if we don't adjust for it, we'll get confounding bias. And so we must include that in our parametric regression model. And my notation at top is a little shorthand for a linear regression model where Y is the outcome with the parameters, the treatment at time 1, that intermediate covariate value, and the treatment at time 2. Unfortunately, X1 is also a collider. You can see there are 2 arrows coming into it, one from the treatment at time 1, and an arrow coming in from U. So it's a collider. So we must exclude it, and we find ourselves in a bind. We both have to include it, and we can't include it. And so I do a little simulation to illustrate why this induces bias. Let's suppose that the true average treatment effect is exactly 100. So I'm going to run this study with 1,000 participants, get an estimate, repeat that 500 times, and I'm going to show you the sampling distribution of the estimates. And so if these were unbiased, we'd see bell curve centered around 100. That's that dashed line. And so up top, you can see what happens when I put X1 in the model. And below, you see what happens when I leave X1 out of the model. So in both cases, the estimators are quite biased. And we can see that here in the summary. They're both a good distance away from the true value of 100. And so the fundamental problem is anytime you have time-varying confounding or time-varying treatments, standard regression methods will lead to biased estimates. For observational studies or RCTs. So this is a general, quite broad problem. But we have some wonderful methods that exist that can handle this kind of situation. There are marginal structural models that can be estimated using inverse probability of treatment weights. A drawback here is that IPTW can induce variance inflation. We've also got the parametric G formula, so which generalizes the idea of standardization. And it's nice because it does not use IPTW, so there's no variance inflation. So it's the effect estimate should be a bit more precise than marginal structural models, but it's computationally expensive because it requires this Monte Carlo simulation step to estimate the treatment effect across the different treatment regimens. And it's subject to the G-null paradox. And the G-null paradox is this finding that if you assume that there is truly a treatment effect when you set up your model, your parametric G formula model, but in reality there is no treatment effect. As you can see, there are no arrows from A1 or A2 into the outcome Y. If that's the truth, but you assume that the arrows exist, the parametric G formula gives you biased estimates. That is, when the truth is 0, the parametric G formula will give you non-zero results. And so that's a result of the sensitivity to model misspecification of the parametric G formula. And that's where orthogonalized regression comes into play. So in our working example here, here's how you'd use orthogonalized regression. First, you'd fit a linear regression model for that intermediate covariate X1 as a function of the treatment at time 1. Then you'd compute the residuals from that model. I'm going to call those X1 twiddle. And we substitute those in for X1. And by doing that, we delete the arrow, the causal pathway from the treatment at time 1 into that intermediate covariate value. And so when that happens, we can see that x1 twiddle, the residuals, are a confounder still. There's a path into the treatment at time 2 and a path to the outcome. So we must include the model, but there's no longer an arrow from A1 coming to x1 twiddle. So it's not a collider. We can safely include it in the model and get unbiased effect estimates. And that's the heart of the method, is using these residuals to delete those arrows that cause collider bias. And so orthogonalized regression is actually an alternative form of the parametric G formula that's not subject to the GNL paradox. It's statistically efficient relative to marginal structural models because it does not use IPTW estimation. And it's computationally efficient relative to the parametric G formula because you don't have to do this Monte Carlo simulation step. So here's some simulations illustrating the statistical efficiency here. So same setup as before, the true value is 100. And that's the dashed line. And you can see our 3 estimators, marginal structural models, parametric G formula, and orthogonalized regression are all dead on, centered at 100. But you can see that the marginal structural models at the top are a bit more spread out. That's due to that variance inflation. And we can see that summarized here in that the marginal structural models have a slightly larger root mean squared error than the other 2 methods. Under the G null setting here, now the truth is 0. There is no treatment effect. And so you can see the marginal structural models at the top and orthogonalized regression at the bottom are centered on 0, but the parametric G formula is slightly biased. It's offset from 0. And we can see that here in that summary that there is some bias to the parametric G formula. We also did some evaluations of the computational efficiency of these methods. So we did some benchmarking, comparing these 3 estimators. Same simulation setup as before. I request 250 bootstrap replicates for all 3 methods, and I don't make any use of parallel computation because that complicates the benchmarking. And I vary the number of observations from 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000. And so you can see once we get out to 100,000 participants, the median computation time for the orthogonalized regression is on the order of seconds because all it requires is a couple linear regression model fits, so it's quite quick. For the marginal structural models, it takes about 3 minutes. That's because you have to fit a couple logistic regression models to get the weights before you can fit the marginal structural model. So it takes a little bit more time. And for the parametric G formula, it takes about 25 minutes because it requires that computationally expensive Monte Carlo simulation step. Now, there is a downside to orthogonalized regression and the parametric G formula relative to IPTW methods. IPTW methods have this attractive workflow property where you can take your outcome, set it aside, stay blinded to it, fit your propensity score model for the treatment, look at the covariate balance, and if the covariate balance is unsatisfactory, you can iterate. You can go back, adjust the model until you get satisfactory covariate balance. But with parametric G formula and orthogonalized regression, the sequence of models you fit requires looking at the outcome, so you can't iterate the model fit in this way without inducing some bias from multiple looks. So that is a downside of orthogonalized regression. Now, the simulations I've shown so far today have looked at just a continuous outcome and 2 time points. We've done some more explorations with multiple time points and looking at binary outcomes and time to event outcomes as well. And so far, the picture seems about the same. Orthogonalized regression is statistically efficient. It's computationally efficient. It's not immune to the GNL paradox. It is immune to the GNL paradox, but it is early days. We've just started exploring this. And so I'm bringing this tool to the community so that we can collectively interrogate it and see where it fits into our EPI toolbox. I'd like to thank my colleagues at Target RWE for supporting and inspiring this work. I'd like to thank you for your time.
Any questions? Please walk up to the microphone. If there is no one yet, then I'll get you started. Thank you very much. Very interesting method you're using. I was wondering a little bit, because you're talking a lot about the methodological part. How do you interpret the outputs you're getting? Because I'm assuming you do still want to estimate the effect of A1 on your outcome, but as I understood, you're kind of taking it out of the model. So how do you interpret what you're getting?
Right, so you can get so the nice thing about the orthogonalized regression is you get unbiased parameter estimates, so you can estimate the effect of A1 alone. Here I was focusing on the average treatment effect of treating it both times. Or you could get just the effect of A1 if that's a quantity of interest.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, please come up to the microphone so we can hear you.
How can we extend your method to multiple, more than two treatment variables? How to extend much more complicated multiple treatment pattern?
So if you have multiple time points?
Yes.
So you kind of follow that same process where you start at the beginning. As you go forward in time, you orthogonalize, you fit a model for those intermediate covariates that are confounders, and then replace them with the residuals from that model. So you have to kind of do that at each time point where those confounders exist.
Then if we have 3 time points, then we should replicate 2 times.
Yeah, so if you have a confounder after treatment 1 and treatment 2, you'd fit a model for the confounder after treatment 1, take the residuals, fit in a model going forward for the confounder after treatment 2, and take those residuals, and then you use those for the final model.
Thank you very much.
You know, US FDA, do you have an R package available for this method?
We do not yet. So this is still, again, a brand new method that's still very much in development, but we are trying to develop some code that we can release.
Okay, thank you.
I think I see some. Oh no. Yeah. Yeah. Please go for it and also.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to talk in a second, so I feel bad for asking a question. But so does orthogonalized regression, are you deleting the arrows, or are you conditioning on those parents? Like, is the residuals going to condition on the variables that are parents of your intermediaries, or is it fully deleting the arrows? Because that has implications for potential M structures or other things. I'm curious.
It essentially deletes the arrow, right? Because you're using the residuals, so there should be no more association between the treatment at time 1 and the residuals at x1.
Jesper?
Yes, I'm the co-chair of this meeting. I had to present in another room from the start, so forgive me for showing up late. I think this sounds incredibly interesting. Could you outline the way forward for this to be eventually something standard? What do we need to clarify before jumping to use it?
Yes, so we need to do much more simulations evaluating its properties under the real world problems we have: missing data, measurement error, more complicated confounding structures, different kinds of study designs. And so there's still a lot of work to do. And we want to compare against more estimators, not just marginal structural models and the parametric G formula. So there's still a lot of work to do, and I'd love to collaborate with you all on kind of extending this outwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm handing over to Jesper now.
Yeah, and I'll introduce myself properly. I'm Jesper Hallas. I'm from the University of Southern Denmark and also co-chairing this session. And our next speaker will be Michael Webster Clark, whom we just heard, and he will give a talk on use of standardization to increase the precision of site-specific estimates in multi-site studies and distributed networks.
Thank you, and it's great to be here at ICPE. This is pretty much 4 years of my life, this presentation. So hopefully it's good. It can fit in 15 minutes. I think will be good. So this work didn't have direct funding, but a lot of people are supported by a lot of things, and no real disclosures for this method's work. So I'm showing this because it's a really common site when it comes to distributed analyses. You've seen a figure like this probably at this ICPE, in fact, where we have this outcome we care about, major bleeding. We have these 2 treatments, and we have a whole bunch of effect estimates. And some of them are different from one another, right? We've got this estimate from CPRD and this estimate from Saskatchewan that don't really conform to kind of that subtotal estimate on the bottom. And one question I've always wondered when I see this chart is, would these still be outliers if the other populations looked like Saskatchewan and CPRD? So what I'm going to answer today is whether it's possible to obtain better or more precise effect estimates in specific target populations within these sorts of multi-site studies using the methods that are currently being used to standardize estimates to specific target populations. So there's a lot of terms in there. I highlighted most of them, and I promise I'll explain what they mean. So first, let's do that explanation. A better effect estimate is an estimate that's more precise than just analyzing the site, right? Because you could just analyze those sites and say that's the estimate, and also correspond to a specific effect measure. You can clearly say this is the estimate in such and such population. Target populations are just specific groups of interest. On that slide, we had Alberta, Saskatchewan, CPRD. All of those are potential target populations we might care about. And multi-site studies are just studies that have a number of data sets collected separately and then combine the results together through some synthesis mechanism. Oftentimes, it's either pooling analytic data sets or just pooling estimates with something like inverse variance weighting. And finally, when I say methods for standardizing to specific populations, I'm talking about inverse odds or weighting or outcome modeling. And I'm going to use IOW here just because it's much easier to show you visually what's happening. So, in case you're not familiar with distributed analyses, the idea is we have these three separate databases that keep their data completely separate, and then some central coordinating center that distributes protocols or analytic code to these different databases. The databases then return their results, represented by the dashed line, specific to their location. And finally, we kind of combine all these together into some rainbow network-wide effect estimate. And this is kind of the effect in the whole network, but not really. That's a whole nother talk to even describe what that's estimating. But what about other target populations we might care about? So this network-wide effect is going to be some sort of weighted average of these three different effects. Depending on what method you use, it's going to weight different areas differently. But what if we also want to know the effect in database 1, or the effect in database 3, or the effect in database 1 and 2 together? So these are not going to correspond to the network-wide effect unless the treatment effect is homogeneous, so unless there's no variation in the treatment effect. So what if we weighted to those target populations before or while we were doing our analytics? So you can see here we've got this blue population, half young, half old in database 1, and then we have this database 2 population that might be our target we care about that's much, much older. And obviously these are two different groups of people, right? Half old, half young, and 90% old, 10% young. We can very plausibly expect that the treatment effect could differ between these two populations. But if we do our weighting methods to make database 1 look like database 2, we shrink down the influence of the young people and we expand the influence of the old people on our estimate. And that's exactly what happens when you do IPTW, but in this case, we're just using inverse odds weights because we're targeting this specific database 2 population. So now we have our estimate from database 2, and we have our estimate from database 1 that's been weighted to database 2. And instead of getting this rainbow estimate that's the network-wide estimate, we get this combined estimate that has a clear target population of database 2. So what about real-world data? Well, last ICP, we presented simulation results showing how this process worked, and we got a poster, and obviously people care more about the real data, so we got an oral this ICP. So we wanted to look at a plausible research question using real-world data from real patients. We're still making a fake distributed network because we still have to get permission to do this in the real network, but I'll explain to you how we're kind of creating that network. So the base study we're using was a new user active comparator study of metformin versus sulfonylureas that was conducted in the Clinical Practice Research Data Link. And it followed people for a whole bunch of safety outcomes to evaluate which of these treatments might be a better therapeutic alternative, although we kind of know which one's a better therapeutic alternative, so this was in many ways a method study to evaluate these different outcomes. And it also linked to hospital episode information and death statistics, and this is really good if you care a lot about a lot of these outcomes that they were measuring, but it has some drawbacks in CPRD because several locations within the UK don't do these linkages. They're concerned about patient privacy and they would contribute data to CPRD, but they're not willing to link to the hospital episodes or the actual deaths. So we modified this study a little bit. It's the same general idea. It's still a new user active comparator study of starting metformins versus starting sulfonylureas, but we're only looking at one outcome for the purposes of this kind of work, and that's all-cause mortality. And we did not require a linkage, and this lets us include some additional regions that are more heterogeneous that weren't going to participate in that original study. And we also used a very simple initial treatment follow-up scheme, again, for the purposes of just showing you some good pictures that are informative. If you wanted to actually answer this question, you would use methods that used all of the data at once. You wouldn't try to split it into a distributed network, which is what we did, right? We carved up the UK into all of these different regions. Notably, this was me in paint. These are not the exact regions that the CPRD uses. It's probably not even the right number because it was really hard to make 11 distinct regions and still have it make any sense at all. And I didn't want to use colors that might confuse people who are colorblind. So first, we did a kind of typical distributed net analysis in this network where we estimated 1-year risk differences for all-cause mortality comparing these two treatments, and we adjusted for a bunch of confounding characteristics that are available in CPRD using inverse probability of treatment weights. This is A1C, BMI, a whole bunch of things. And then we bootstrapped this 2,000 times to get 95% confidence limits for these 1-year risk differences within each location and pooled these using inverse variance weighting. We could have used random effects modeling, but I promise it's not too important for the point of this presentation. But we also did an analysis that targeted the smallest region specifically to try to recover an estimate in that area. And so after we did all our IPTW stuff, we also estimated these inverse odds weights based on variables we thought might modify the treatment effects, things like age, sex, BMI, coronary artery disease, a few other things. And then we combined those inverse odds weights with the IPTW from each site and calculated risk differences in each region using these new combined weights to account for both the differences between them in the smallest region and to account for confounding at the same time. Again, we did a whole bunch of replicates and we pooled these using inverse variance weighting. And this is technically, there's slightly better ways to do this, but some simulation work by Issa de Hebra et al. Found that this IVW kind of works here in a reasonable way. So what did we see? These are the original results. This is kind of the standard distributed analysis. The I-squared is 71%. This corresponds to a fair amount of heterogeneity. You can see that there are some big regions that just barely include or don't include kind of the dashed line that is the summary estimate, and that's why it's kind of seeing that high amount of heterogeneity. And then this is what happens when we reweighted to Northern Ireland, which was actually region 11. And you can see I-squared drops to 21%. The estimate goes up. And perhaps most interestingly, the estimate is very precise compared to the data just from Northern Ireland. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So risk differences everywhere moved up once we weighted the regions to look more like the region we cared about. And the pooled estimates differed greatly after weighting to Northern Ireland, but were slightly less precise. So we lost precision when we made that decision to go to Northern Ireland as our target, which we would expect because not every region is exactly like Northern Ireland. And the pooled estimate, and this is what I was most impressed with, was the precision of that pooled estimate, but also still being consistent with the Northern Ireland estimate. It wasn't super outside of it. It wasn't just dead set on the original estimate. It did change when we included these variables. So what do we have to gain from kind of doing this in real analyses that are of public health importance? Well, for one thing, we get a well-defined target population. It's not the Sentinel Network target population or the CNODE's target population. It's the Canadian population or this province or that province. And we get better understanding of whether treatment effect heterogeneity is responsible for these differences across sites. And I'll talk more about this in like 30 minutes. And we also get those much more precise estimates in specific sites, which is really, really good for smaller sites that otherwise would not have a very informative estimate if you just relied on them alone. There are limitations, obviously, so this doesn't account for differences in internal validity across sites. And in fact, if those internal validity differences are correlated with the things we weight on, it causes some issues. And it can't account for unmeasured things, unmeasured confounders, unmeasured modifiers. And you do have to actually share data across sites, which can be a potential obstacle. And so we really want to demonstrate this in a real network. If you have a real network you would give to us, please email us, or we'll use CNODEs, but we'd really like to kind of launch this in terms of a real network. Thanks.
Thanks to Michael for keeping the time. There are lots of time for questions.
Hey, Michael, Bradley Layton, RTA Health Solutions. Thanks so much. You were rushing through at the end, but you made that kind of critical note that it required individual level data sharing. Can you talk a bit about actually what data is required, and because that can be a constraint in many of these distributed data networks?
So individual level, technically I would say it does not require. It needs the joint distributions of the modifying variables. And at least in our case with the ones we used, I would feel like there's no identifying information in there anymore once you make these joint tables. Now, I'm sure other places might feel differently.
the notable thing that's really interesting to me is that if a site didn't want to do this, they wouldn't have to. They don't need to share it to implement this and target a population. It's just they wouldn't get the advantages you get from doing this. We wouldn't be able to target that site using this method. It would only be available to the sites that do share. So there's kind of a carrot there that's an incentive. But you can take out all the dates, you can take out almost everything and just sit with the modifying information.
Right, thank you.
Other questions? It seemed like a bit of magic to me that you have a small region with few outcomes, I suppose. That's why the confidence intervals are wide to begin with. And now you have narrow confidence intervals, and yet you don't have more outcomes in your small region. So in some way, it inherits the precision of the overall estimate. And you outlined the conditions for making this inference. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, so what this method is really relaxing is it's taking us away from the perspective that we can't learn anything about this group from people outside the group. If you believe you can't learn anything about some group of people from other people, then you can only use the outcomes in those people, right? What this method does is say, well, maybe we can learn some things and maybe they would be the same if we accounted for this, 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 and this. And the variance cost you pay is how much of a stretch accounting for this, 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 and this is. So you're using those external outcomes, but if those regions are totally different from the region you care about, that'll be expressed in your confidence intervals. You won't get those hyper-precise confidence intervals if one area is totally unique with respect to the variables you used. If that reassures you, it does seem like magic.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You also pointed out to the fact that if there are effect modifiers that you cannot measure or do not know about, this will fail. Yeah. Good point. Other questions? Yeah.
I think it kind of goes hand in hand with what you were just talking about. So if, for example, you have a population that is skewed to being predominantly male, and we're looking to adjust to a different population that is predominantly female, and we know that there are sex differences in drug effects in the population, do you feel that this model or this method would be impacted by things that aren't necessarily just adjustable? Like you had just spoken about age, for example. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. There's a paper that Alex Kyle and I just worked on that captures some of what it means as far as things you do need to control for. And we're thinking about extending it to some other areas beyond kind of these regional things. We started with the regions because I think we agree that the treatment doesn't biologically differ in Northern Ireland. In theory, there would be some set of things that would do it. But yeah, especially if you're trying to go from men to women as your groups, for example, that's a lot of things you would need to think about really capturing. So it's a good point.
We have time for one more question.
One more, if there are no other questions. This is very low. Anyway, thank you for your talk. You started off with saying that in the CPRD, there are some regions that don't have outcome data. Would this method be, or like no linkage? But I understood from your talk, you only used places with outcome data. Like, could you extend this into saying, okay, if we don't have linkage, we can use it to generalize like our estimates, or is that too far?
So I think you could very easily do something like that if you don't have outcome data. To clarify, we did have outcome data, but we didn't have the linkage to ONS. So we were using kind of, the CPRD has its own measure of outcome as far as mortality goes. And we were using that rather than the more like rigorously validated other outcome, which has potential implications because if there's measurement error, misspecification, it can mess with things. But yeah, there is potential as long as you can specify a target population and communicate the distribution of covariates of that to your data partners, you can estimate an effect in that target population with the assumptions we discussed.
Thank you, Michael. And our next speaker is Alec Walker, who will talk about non-parametric assignment of stratum membership to achieve covariate balance in small cohorts.
Okay. Let's see. Slideshow from the beginning. Well, I think Michael's given us a wonderful example of 4 years well spent, now for something completely different. I'm going to talk about, this is a result of a collaboration with my colleagues in Boston, Max Russo, Mia Schneeweiss, and Bob Glynn, and we're going to talk about a methodology for dealing with confounder control when the number of cohort members is very small. Neither I nor the co-authors have any conflicts of interest or financial relationships to disclose. So the study setting that brought this problem to our attention was safety surveillance of newly introduced drugs. At first, this work involved small cohorts, non-interventional comparative studies. Our primary aims are to calculate the population's average treatment effect and to delve into within-stratum effects, where we will eventually look for subpopulations with reduced effects or unexpected harms. So these are exploratory studies. Now, there are standard techniques for cohort assembly, the most straightforward is non-parametric, involving matching or exhaustive cross-classification. These are limited to settings with a small number of covariates and a large pool of untreated subjects to guarantee that all the matched units have comparators. The parametric route involves stratification using balancing scores, such as propensity scores, which are suitable for possibly large numbers of covariates. However, unanswerable questions linger about the appropriateness of the models or the random error in the estimates. Now, our focus today is on a strategy for creating strata that optimize both within stratum and overall population similarity between treated and comparator subjects. This involves setting loss goals, and I'll expand on that, and utilizing non-parametric algorithms to assign stratum membership. The approach is semi-parametric because the loss function contains parameters while the optimization algorithm remains parameter-free. I'll introduce a loss function based on Euclidean distances in a scaled covariate space between treated and comparator subjects. Now, optimal stratum assignment can be represented as a solution vector whose elements are the stratum assignments and whose length is the number of individuals in the study. The space of potential solutions is enormous, being the number of records raised to the power of the number of strata. The task is to find a vector that corresponds to the minimum of the loss function. For this purpose, we've used the R package GNU or RGNU, which is a genetic or evolutionary algorithm package, which is essentially a trial and error method, which takes a whole raft of initial solutions, takes the best ones, and then as the start of doing variations on those, and taking the best ones again, taking variations, and then stopping when the mutation process doesn't result in any better loss function. So to illustrate this semi-parametric methodology, we crafted a loss function based on Euclidean distances in scaled covariate space. The two components are our population-weighted squared Euclidean distance, which is PSED, and you see this is the distance for each covariate, that D, and this is the weight for each stratum, and these are just the squared sums of distances, and then summed over the covariates. So this is a standardized difference, and this is the corresponding Euclidean distance, and then we have a squared within stratum distance where we take each of the covariate distances and then apply a weight to them. This particular loss function was tailored to the goals of minimizing within stratum and overall Euclidean distance, but it's just an example. So we calculate each loss component with a special provision forbidding a single empty cell in a stratum Using Janud, we used lexical minimization to optimize the overall balance. And among the solutions with near optimal overall balance, we also minimized the covariant discrepancies within strata. Now, we studied this procedure using simulated data. In the simulations, there are 4 strong covariate predictors of treatment assignment with different sampling distributions, symmetric and asymmetric and low and high prevalence binomials. These were combined in a logistic function to produce a record-specific treatment probability, which was subsequently converted into a treatment assignment. Here's an instance of the generated data. Since each covariate was a positive predictor of treatment in the crude average, was a positive predictor of treatment in the crude average, each has, whoops, wrong button. There we go. And each in the crude, each has a higher value in the treated than the non-treated. The population-weighted covariate values, now this is the stratification that was produced by the minimization. You see the population-weighted covariate values to 2 digits are identical, and they are in fact essentially the same. And even within strata, I mean, this was a secondary goal, there's a lot of balance between all the covariates, so that if you were to explore an analysis, at least it wouldn't be confounded by these particular covariates. Now, here we've got the summary statistics for each covariate. Remember, there are different kinds of covariate distributions for 100 repetitions. Compared to the crude, each of the panels gives the percentage improvement in discrepancy or in bias in covariate values for the population-weighted average values. The top panel shows the results from the semi-parametric procedure. As we saw in the single data instance, 99% or more of the crude imbalance is removed. By comparison, and only for comparison, just to give us an order of magnitude sense, the relative improvements under a propensity score decile stratification or with inverse probability of treatment weights are rarely above 90%. Now, our co-author Mia Schneeweiss and her colleagues have assembled cohorts of adolescents treated with immunosuppressants for psoriasis. This slide shows baseline data from 361 adolescents who received ustekinumab or methotrexate. They're both potent immunosuppressants. The variables that are shown sorted by the size of the unadjusted differences comparing ustekinumab and methotrexate. And I want to draw your attention to the last 2 columns, which give the percent reduction in the crude covariate difference achieved through the semi-parametric method and for comparison of propensity decile stratification. Since a critical outcome for Schneeweiss and her team is future infection, we can focus for a minute on the balance achieved for a history of prior infection, which would be a strong predictor of future infection in these young people. You can see from the crude results that ustekinumab was preferred to methotrexate for patients with prior infections at baseline, resulting in a prevalence difference of 4.1%. Control through propensity decile stratification left a residual imbalance of 2.1%, whereas the semi-parametric stratification essentially abolished the difference between the 2 treatment groups. So in conclusion, and I really just want to sort of open sort of a path for investigation here, this semi-parametric approach offers a way to minimize arbitrary loss functions. The method doesn't require modeling of exposure covariate relations or risk functions. The example loss functions that we used provided a versatile technique for balancing covariates within strata and overall within a limited range of simulations and example. But importantly, many other loss functions could have been imagined depending on what your particular analytic needs might be. So in the future, bearing in mind this possibility, what you might consider doing and where you don't need to feel limited even with a small population, is to decide what you need, what you want to optimize in your design, and then optimize your treatment assignment or your stratum assignments to meet your needs. So my co-authors and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Alec Walker, and thank you for keeping the time so nicely. There's ample time for questions, so please come forward to the microphone. No questions?
Yes, or I should say, this is one of the joys of working in a field that nobody else is working in. Yeah. I did compare it to a variety of other methods. Now, you remember that the method is not tied to the loss function that I chose. Okay, so that loss function has these characteristics, but there surely are better ones. And also, I should say that when you're using the evolutionary algorithm that was accessible to us, there may well be much better non-parametric algorithms. Let me digress. For genetic algorithms, evolutionary algorithms, you never really know that you're at an optimum. You know your local optimum, but with 10 to the 200th possibilities, you're not completely sure. What you do know, though, is let's just sort of look at these ones from Mia's study, that we've essentially limited all of the confounding for all of the, or potential confounding for all of the important covariates. So I would contend that in the universe of potential comparators, none are going to be much better than this one. And an advantage of stratification that we used to use a lot was trying to figure out affect heterogeneity and understand for future design what we're doing. This preserves that, this particular loss function and strategy preserves that and the ability to do it. Where you do see some issues, so if I can go back to maybe here, if you look at the prevalence of treatment in these different strata that were created by this particular optimization procedure, there are very highly imbalanced strata. And in fact, if you plot this against an ordinary propensity stratification, they're reasonably correlated. So it has some of those properties, even though it's derived differently. What this means is that your variance inflation for almost anything that you're going to calculate from this is, if it's going to respect the stratification, incorporate some highly imbalanced strata. And one of the areas, and this is not superior to a whole variety of other ways of achieving balance. It's got a slightly higher, what's called variance inflation ratio. And a reasonable step forward with this would be to actually try to include in the loss function a minimization of the variance of the ATE, so you get something like a TMLE estimate as directly as part of the loss function. And again, the comfort here, as little as you or I may understand the evolutionary algorithm, the comfort is you can see what you get and that you can decide what you want it to look like in advance.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's time for other questions, but I'm sure you can ask them after the meeting. Thanks. And our last speaker is the same as the fourth, Michael Clark.
Thank you, everyone. So this one was not 4 years of work, so it should be easier. Essentially, what I'm going to talk about today is kind of an augmentation of some, again, previous work from another ICP, but the whole idea is to use the inverse odds weights that I talked about in my last presentation to explore the extent to which they can separate modification by measured variables from better confounding control when we do some level of covariate restriction. So this was funded by a grant from NIH, but no other conflicts here. And I'm going to start again with something we'll often see in published manuscripts or at ICP, where we have some study that's done in older adults, we have some overall estimate, and then we might have some other estimate in which we've restricted based on predicted probability or actual frailty. And the big question is, what can we take away from these two different numbers, right? These are qualitatively different risk differences. We might be concerned about whether, did we remove confounding? Did we get better control for confounding by restricting to this one strata? Or is it because the overall population just has a different distribution than the people who have a low predicted probability of frailty when it comes to variables that modify the treatment effect we care about? So is there some sort of rule or heuristic we can use to identify when restriction changes effect estimates because of measured effect measure modifying characteristics, or EMMs, rather than because of unmeasured variables? And I think this is kind of a problem at the heart of epidemiology. I cheated a little bit with how I articulated this, but hopefully people will pick up on that as I go. So again, when I say restriction here, this is something very familiar to most of us, but the idea of limiting our analysis to one stratum of interest rather than combining estimates from multiple strata in order to inform our estimate that we walk away from our analysis from. Measured effect measure modifying characteristics are just variables that are measured in the full data set that may be associated with different treatment effects on our scale of interest. Think age itself might be associated with a stronger treatment effect or worse toxicity or something like that. And unmeasured variables includes both confounders and these modifiers that we don't have any information on within our data set. So think of just your classic unmeasured confounders or your classic predictors of different treatment effects that we can't measure, like genetics, for example, in a lot of our studies that may modify how drugs are metabolized or how they take effect in people. So first of all, why do we restrict in pharmacoepi? This is because confounding is a comparison, so which comparator you pick changes whether you have confounding, and also a population-specific phenomenon. If you change your population, you potentially change the amount of confounding. And if we believe that one strata of our population has less or no confounding, and then we limit our analyses to those people, we reduce bias, right? We've eliminated or at least reduced the confounding bias. So a lot of the time, this is why we do our analyses limited to people who are indicated for treatment or people without contraindications. Or we do an analysis in young people so we don't have to worry about frailty. Or we do one in less frail people so we don't have to worry about frailty. But what do we do with those restricted estimates? Well, we usually conclude that the difference between our full and restricted estimates is due to residual confounding or unmeasured confounding. I know some people hate residual confounding as a term. And then we use the restricted estimate as our best guess as to the treatment effect in the full population. We kind of say, okay, we have these less confounded people, we're going to use their estimate to stand in for everyone's estimate. This works great with uniform treatment effects. So if you're in a space where treatment effects are uniform, go ahead, do this approach. You might pursue some of the stuff I talked about earlier, but it's pretty effective there. But what about heterogeneity, right? Things aren't always the same. They're not always uniform. And if the treatment effect varies on our scale of interest, we can't assume anymore that the difference between our estimates is because of the better confounding control. And we also can't assume that the restricted estimate is a good estimate of the full population treatment effect. But the phenomenon I talked about earlier of external validity and inverse odds weights can really help us out here, where we can reweight one population, in this case our restricted population, to resemble another population in terms of effect measure modifying covariates. And these are obviously really helpful for survey sampling and external validity, and can also help us create this heuristic I'm going to go over towards the end of the talk today, if we're willing to make, again, some big assumptions that I'll talk about at the end of the talk. So our core simulation was really very simple. We have this binary treatment X, this binary outcome Y, two binary confounding variables C1 and C2, and then we restrict our analysis to people with C1 equals 1. So the idea is we think that there's less confounding within the level of C1 corresponding to C1 equals 1. There's also different distributions of C2 in C1 equals 1 and C1 equals 0. You can see that because there's the arrow on the graph representing a causal effect of C1 on C2. So you'd expect to see different distributions of C2. And we think that C2 could be an effect measure modifying variable. And if that's the case, this restriction gets a little tricky. So the way you might represent this is to have this kind of unmeasured confounder that may or may not be associated with levels of C1. So we made a bunch of different scenarios, specifically 4, where the first one was, what if there's no confounding that we didn't account for, and what if there's no measured EMM by C2? So C2 isn't a modifier, there's no confounding. What if there is confounding for scenario 2, but there's no there's confounding in C1 equals 0, but there's no EMM by C2. Maybe I should have not used C1 and C2 here. And in C3, we've got the reverse, where there's no confounding, but there is modification. And finally, what if there's both? And we kind of just walked through, what do these estimates look like? Where we first estimated the effect in C1 equals 1, and then the effect in C1 equals 0. We estimated the effect in C1 after we made the people with C1 equals 1 look like the people with C1 equals 0 when it comes to C2. I promise this will be even clearer on the actual analytic slides. And then we did the reverse, where we made the C1 equals 0 people look like the C1 equals 1 people. And there's a couple, 4 key comparisons we made. So first, you compare those restricted estimates to one another. Then you compare the estimate in your stratum with less confounding to the estimate in that same stratum made to look like the other one. And then you do the comparisons of the reverse. And finally, you kind of sit down and have this kind of thought process that I'll walk through in a second. So first off, here's scenario A. So this is the scenario with no confounding and no effect measure modification whatsoever. And what you can see is that the restriction doesn't do anything, right? If there's no difference in confounding between your strata, in expectation, you're going to return identical estimates for strata C equals 1 and C equals 0. One might be more variable than the other, but this is exactly what you're expected to observe. So this is the essential point of that first comparison. If you make that first comparison and the results are the same, you suggest that there's probably no advantage in confounded control or change in modifying covariance. If there is confounding, what you see is first that the C1 equals 1 and C1 equals 0 estimates are different, but you also see that the C1 equals 1 and the reweighted C1 equals 1 estimates don't change. So if there's no heterogeneity, your results in C1 equals 1 will stay the same when you use your inverse odds weights, because you might increase your variance, as you can see here, but you're not going to change your point estimate in any meaningful way because there's no heterogeneity. That's exactly what the odds weights are telling you. In scenario C, where there is no confounding, but there is modification, once again, we see different estimates in the 2 restricted strata. Those are still different. But now when we do the comparisons, we can see that the estimates flip essentially when we do the odds weighting. So if you make the C1 equals 1 people look like the C1 equals 0 people, you get the same estimate. If you make the C1 equals 0 people look like the C1 equals 1 people, again, you get the same estimate. And what that's telling you is that this isn't confounding, this is modification at work. You can learn about the C1 equals 1 people from the C1 equals 0 people without worries about different confounding. And that has implications for what you can estimate. And finally, there's kind of the worst case and probably most likely scenario of what happens when you have both of these phenomena going on. And in this case, you see that we don't get that perfect flipping that we saw before, but we do get some movement in both of these estimates. So both the C1 equals 1 stratum estimate and the C1 equals 0 stratum estimate move towards each other, essentially. They don't go all the way because there is still confounding, there is still some differences, but you see movement in these very specific ways. So in a quick overall heuristic, you can ask this series of questions. Are the stratum estimates equal? If they are, you don't really have evidence of either of these phenomenon. If the stratified estimates aren't equal, you can see if the less confounded stratum stays the same after weighting. And if it does, then it's probably not heterogeneity that you measured that's causing the difference in estimates. If the less confounded estimate changes after weighting, you kind of end up at this awkward position of, well, do we think the estimates are kind of equal and balance each other out? If so, you don't have confounding. If you're in that in-between area, you kind of end up with both. So This helps us recover unbiased estimates in multiple populations. We can do some combination we talked about earlier. We can rule out measured modification as the source of the difference in estimate. And it's really straightforward to describe. Well, I hope it was. Maybe it's not straightforward now that I've given the talk. But it obviously assumes that you correctly identify the less confounded strata. And it doesn't rule out unmeasured modifiers as the reason that your estimates differ. You can only account for the measured ones. You also need to properly specify a whole bunch of different things, and in small samples, you can't really get those great results that we showed in the simulation. So this heuristic is more for when you have those really huge registry-based or claims-based data sets. I'll acknowledge all these co-authors from UNC, and I think I went long on this one, but happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Michael. An example of 10 minutes well spent. Yeah. So, questions?
Frederick Nyberg, Gothenburg University. If I understand, these are you restricting, you doing separate analysis for each one of these. So another way to retrieve a stratum-specific estimate would be to introduce an interaction term into your original model, which sort of, unless you introduce interaction terms for the confounders also, you would then assume the same confounding structure in both models and then retrieve the effect modification in a way. Have you sort of considered that scenario and how that relates to what you're doing here?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing that I hadn't thought about too much. I usually, if I ever want to look at differences, just because of some other work I've done, I really look for these kind of highly conditional estimates versus almost those interaction terms from the statistical models. I kind of look at the population effects and then compare those. But I think that could be a really interesting way to do this with kind of fewer steps to explore those different outcome models in the different populations. Yeah.
Thank you. Great talk. Both talks are great. Michael, I missed a step when you described your first talk of the weighting method. So you mentioned the conceptually very simple conceptually how you make a person in population 1 similar to a person in population 2. I'm thinking in my head, how would you do this? Because there are there be multiple characteristics that are different, right? Race, gender, age, ethnicity, there are lab tests, etc. How would you make one at the person level, make it similar to another person?
Yeah, so one of the nice things about population health and populations versus precision medicine in people is that the methods like the weighting don't actually make the people the same, they make the populations the same. So to a certain extent, you rely on your ability to find the young people who are also old and give them not young people who are old, the young people who are, for example, have higher BMI or whatever, and all of those vectors go into a single weight that you can then use in your analysis. So the idea is less that you're taking people in your study and making them look like people in the target, and more that you're taking the population of your study and making it look like the population of your target. Once you get to the person level, in order to be remotely anything close to non-parametric, you end up just with essentially super stratification and cutting down to really small samples.
Just to clarify, is that done through some concept like a propensity score you estimate? Okay.
Yeah, so inverse odds weighting actually just uses essentially a sampling propensity score, although some people don't like calling it sampling, so that's why I have the air quotes, because oftentimes you're not actually doing sampling. It's just like how you can use odds weights with a propensity score to get an estimate in the treated. It's just you use inverse odds weights with this kind of sampling score to get an estimate in your target.
One last quick question. How is this different from you pool all your patients in one population, you run the model, then you re-weight the covariate? You use estimate. For example, in your population, you have 60% male, 40% female. Your target is 50-50. But in your estimate, you can tweak the covariate to produce the estimate.
Yeah, so that's essentially what happens if you use some of the outcome modeling based methods that I was talking about. I just use the weighting because I'm more confident kind of in getting that kind of pseudo propensity score for sampling right. I'm more confident in that than building the outcome model, but yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Michael. Great work. Paul Kaplan. So one potential application of this would be in propensity score matching, where so with matching you can get good a valid comparison between the two groups. But then there's a question of, is there effect modification in the people that you weren't able to match? Could you talk about applying this method for that purpose?
Yeah, so there's actually some work that I'm working on related to this presentation I just gave, where we're essentially going from this type of restriction where we have this covariate restriction to some level of restriction on something like a propensity score. And you can kind of think of the matching as very similar to that. And thinking about, well, would our matched population have had a different treatment effect if it had had the same distribution of this, this, and this variable as the original population? You can do that. There are some issues in terms of what you need to account for, particularly for relative scale effects. It is very surprising the number of things you need to put in there. And you can end up in a situation where you kind of removed confounding, but you might add it back in a little bit. It gets funky. But yeah, it is something we're working on.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think we've spent all our 90 minutes and we spent them well. Let's give a big hand of applause to our excellent speakers.